Okay, more on the Descartes superimposition over the head of Heidegger and Husserl, all whizzed up together in connection to this Ernest Sosa analytic philosophy presentation on the first two sections of the Meditations. I guess he says the first two plus one paragraph or two paragraphs of the third section. So what does it mean that Descartes says that this, unlike the conclusion reached by Sosa, Descartes himself says, my book on the Meditations, that was a metaphysical thing. So I believe how Descartes understands metaphysical is this question of both the sort of the gauge of how real something is. So if you think of it's not so long before Descartes, and Descartes still in this tradition, though he doesn't like it, and he's trying to cast it off. He's casting off the Aristotelian Catholic synthesis. And I suppose you could say Anselm is not quite mixed up in that himself, because he's prior to the time when Mr. Doctor of the Church, Thomas, came in and took over. But I think it runs pretty much the same as the idea that Thomas formalizes and thinks through more clearly and brings to a higher level in terms of the scholastic systematization of it, spelling it out in examples and arguments and so in his common style, his well-known style. The idea which I'm not sure that well where it stems from, but probably you see a big burst of it with the Neoplatonists and with the Manichae, in a certain way, in a funny way. The Manichae deal always with two terms. So the idea that I'm getting at is this idea that there's either being or the lack of being. It's probably already in Plato and Aristotle in some way. I can't say that offhand what the examples would be. But in any case, it doesn't particularly matter. What I was trying to get at is, in contrast to what the Manichae, I'm just thinking it comes to higher level of consciousness around the time of the Neoplatonists, because at the same time the Manichae come out with a principle which is consciously against this, which is that there's always good and evil. So it's like the deprivation of being, which would be the deprivation of the good, is represented as an eternal feature by the Manichaeans, whereas the more simplistic Christians, as it were, only believe in being. So but being in the sense of something like the Platonic good, which if it reaches its fullness would have reached perfection, which would be something like God thinking into the world his divine plan, which would be ontological truth as teleological idea as I guess the unmoved mover of Aristotle and whatever corresponds to that in later thinking and in Catholic thinking. But there's sort of more and more consciousness of this problem shows there. But by Anselm's time, which is quite a bit later, I don't know, 600 years later, we have this simple statement about how it's obvious that a thing that is in reality is quote unquote greater I forget what it's in Latin. I forget what it's something that's an easy equivalent to Magnus or some form of Magnus is greater than just the mere thinking or imagining or dreaming, as Descartes brings in the dream. Um, so he assumes this relation of it's something that's in before us is more real, therefore it has more being, therefore it's better. So like if you just have the idea, it would become greater um, if it were also real. I mean, say you have some idea of God, for instance, that everyone should, with veracity, they really mean it, say, my life is terrific and uh, life is terrific. And if you could bring about that state, that would have been the realization of the teleology or the plan, the design that God had all along. And that's what the world's for. And then you put a sort of sticker on that and you write in black pen, God. And that's what God would mean, something like that, in the sense of the ontological truth in the theological sense. So then you get to Descartes, and it seems like what he wants to say is we have to leave out all this Aristotelian stuff, but he's at great pains. You think of the great themes of Leo Strauss, of the tyranny of writing, that you can't write just what you want, because if you do that, you'll get slammed down and you'll get deplatformed and so on, because there's powers that be. So he has to. So in this way, I can see where Sosa thinks it's theological, because he has to constantly sort of scrape and bow to the theologians who are and the devout people who are in charge of the universities, who he's appealing to, and who he really wants to shine before. He wants them to accept his new science, as it were. But what is his view, which takes the place of that? It's like what he's saying is the truth is only going to be limited to the lower truths. So it's like the lower truth is kind of like rather than the mind of God to the world, the teleological sense that I just went through, it's more like Christ logos, or you could say it in a way just to flesh out the historical development. The Heraclitean logos has to be adequate in Thomas's term. It has to have this adequatio with the reality, and the reality means the external thing. Because remember, again, if I just think a world with everything I just said, where people think the world, life is, wake up really thinking life is terrific, just the thought of that is not as great as the reality of it. That's a simple idea, right? So what Descartes is saying is what would adequate that. What I just said, probably this is beyond his pay grade. Let's leave that to the wise, to the wiser to deal with. But he just wants to deal with the logos which conforms to or is adequate to the world of extension, which he shows in greater detail with the, we're all familiar with it from early grade school, with this Cartesian grid, which allows you to take two fixed lines to tell you where something is in space. Only through this Cartesian thinking can we make solid progress in our knowledge. And he's at pains to show that, as it were, the object of the logos, and the logos is speaking truly, is ought to speak in the highest terms it can speak in are in terms of the Cartesian grid, basically. Because if you bring in sort of warm flesh pressing against you, like something where you can be accused of being subjective. But even the sense of solidity of an object, if you bring anything else in, then we can say this is not the most real thing. So this is the metaphysical issue could be regarded as he's trying to say what's most real, what's least subject to relativism, as it were, or to um, obscure intentio, like that the intentions are obscured and made sui generis because for each one the subjective experience is different. But for each one, it's the same with respect to measurement and the Cartesian grid. But he wants to show that this is what he calls the substance. So the substance is what stays the same amidst all the, as it were, the patchings and the knittings up of the coat of the play of time. So sometimes Socrates is sitting down. Sometimes he's wearing a tunic. Sometimes he's talking. Sometimes he's not doing those things. If you try to write down the truth about Socrates at any given moment, it will be false in the next moment. But there's something that is a substance that's always there. That's Socrates. So what he's trying to say is the most real is the substance, and the substance of which is basically the object of the logos which says what is true in this. I don't know how they put it. It's sort of meaningless the way it's not meaningless, but it's insufficient the way the analytic philosophy applies to. They claim that one of their own, like in 1970 or something, invented the idea of truth as correctness, or however they call it. I forget. I don't want to go into the details of all that stuff now, but it's clear that, of course, the idea of the adequatio or the correctness or conforming to the truth, that the logos says what is true, is this goes all the way back to Aristotle. So, and then it's just that, Plato is more doubtful and Aristotle is more dogmatic, you could say. But you see it very clearly in the tradition that Descartes is sort of breaking away from, although you could wonder, in a way he has to keep to it because he really wants to impress these professors who are the representatives of that tradition, or trained in that tradition. He's trained in it too, but he doesn't want to train others in it. So he's getting rid of one of the three types of adequatio truths in the older tradition. He's getting rid of one of them, and he's kind of saying we'll leave that to the preserve of you guys. Well, I only want to demonstrate about this business between the reality and the speaker. So Plato had said, and it still comes down to us in a way, and it's only probably Husserl and Heidegger that really make an attempt at overthrowing it. That although of course you see it here in Descartes in a kind of almost like he doesn't notice that he's doing it, that Plato had said that thinking should be understood as logos, basically as reasoning. Like you can make a distinction between intellect proper as nous, which is not subject to time, and then reasoning, which obviously, like right now, when any speaking is in a way reasoning. We're suffering to undergo the speech, which will then something can hatch out of it. So if you insist on the strictness of formal thought and start to make unit categories like antecedents and the results of those antecedents, antecedents and consequences, and you start to formalize your logic, then what will happen is that you start to focus on this move back and forth between the material and the strict or the formal, but um, what happens in Husserl is that he stops treating language in this sense of as an inference machine, whether coming out of the material, which means sort of just our daily speech, or this what the analytic philosophy department is somewhat obsessed with, even though I remember a student once said to me, they don't even, she says, they don't even offer a logic course in the philosophy department. And this is true because they offer it over in the math department. They don't care about, because philosophy could only deal with syllogistics. It can't deal at its highest level with, it does deal with all this proposition logic where you use your symbols and stuff, but it's very primitive compared to the mathematical stuff. And a lot of universities don't teach it anymore because people don't really believe in the connection to it to daily life. But basically, the Earthsprung is that in daily life, the way we convince ourselves of things is basically the same as the way you do it in once you start putting rules on speech and calling it logic. But you can drift more one way or the other. So Husserl is throwing this off, and Heidegger's throwing this off, and then you can see that where Plato says defines thinking as speaking to ourselves in the psyche or in the soul, the psyche in Latin, or as we could say, talking to ourselves in the head or in the mind, so that we say something to ourselves, rehearse it, and we could say the exact same thing out loud to somebody. Same thing, that's all thinking would be. And that's mostly as it's been thought, but then you see how this is totally different in Descartes. But what I was trying to get at is Descartes is breaking even from the distinction between the thinking and the reality, where he says, oh, just thinking, Anselm says, just thinking is obviously less beingful than really being. So it's greater when it's really being. Descartes is denying that. So then you can no longer, so we have to get into what that distinction means,